Well, it's time to start again, and so here we go. I don't poop around anything, we just get right into it. What we were talking about last time was the Articles of Confederation, which I may have called a constitution, and it sort of was, but really a better term to describe that would be that it's a contract. It's a contract among the 13 states. The key to understanding what's going on here is that we have 13 states, each of which has its own government. And those 13 states have decided to enter into a contract, an agreement among themselves to set up what they called a Congress and to let the Congress make certain decisions for them. Let Congress act in their behalf, especially in dealing with foreign countries, which means dealing in such topics as war and peace. So the 13 states have agreed to work together, and they call themselves the United States just as a term to describe this arrangement they have made among themselves. Yeah. It's a little dicey, and it's somewhat complicated, and it's arguable. You could take either side in this, but I've tried to say that, well, it really wasn't, the United States was not a nation, and Congress was not a government. And I fall back on the two familiar failures of the Articles, that Congress had no power to tax and no power to regulate trade among the states, to treat the United States as an economic unit, as one economic body where the rules are all the same for the whole country. No, the rules are made each state and they're all different. And we're going to talk more about that, and we're going to see that that causes a lot of problems, and that's going to be actually that's sort of the reason that the whole Article of Confederation failed. But we'll get there. We aren't there yet. But the 13 states each had, as a government, each had a constitution. And one of the things that went on during the Revolution, while the war was being fought, each state was in the process of writing a new state constitution. So those are where there's constitutions, those are where there are governments. Those are the real governments in this place. It's 13 state governments, each of which has its own state constitution. It's a little hard to generalize here because every state adopted a state constitution, and they all had unique features. It's a little hard to try to put them all into just one big pot and say, well, here's what the state constitutions were like, here's what state governments were. They all had many, many differences. They were adopted in different ways. The procedures that the states used to form their constitutions were different. The way they were set up were different. The timing was different. A couple of states had constitutions right away, right off the bat. Those two states were Connecticut and Rhode Island, and those were the only two colonies that still had their charters. They had not been started as charter colonies, they hadn't been started as businesses the way that Virginia and Massachusetts Bay had, but they had each gotten charters at some point in their history. They did it retroactively after they were settled. They went to back to England and asked for a charter, and they got a charter, setting up a colonial government, and those were still there. So those were two colonies that still had their charters, and those were the two colonies I think I mentioned did not have governors appointed by the king. The other 11 colonies all had royal colony governors. Connecticut and Rhode Island had governors that they elected themselves under the terms of their charter. So they had colonial charters. There are only two of the colonies, and both small colonies, but they did have charters, and they just took their charter out and said, well, now we're going to call it the state constitution. So they had theirs done immediately. Other states took longer. Some states went through it quickly, some took a long time. I think the last one to get a state constitution was Massachusetts, which didn't get a constitution until like 1785. I mean, they kicked it around and they kicked it around and they argued about it and argued about it and had several drafts and they couldn't decide and they went back and forth. And so every state's different, and some states took a long time and so forth. There are a couple of generalizations that I can make about those 13 state constitutions. The main one, and this is a theme that I talked about in the last lecture, the main thing that they had in common was that they all were committed to a republican form of government. They were all very self-conscious about being republics. And what that meant was that they were definitely not going to have monarchies. That's what we agree on. That's what Americans all agree on. We are not having any kind of anything that looks like or smells like monarchy. We are not going to have any hereditary offices. The idea that anybody could inherit a position, which was common in England, the House of Lords, the monarchy itself, were all inherited. No, not in America. That we all agree on. There is no such thing as an inherited aristocracy or anything like that in America. We all have republics. Now, the details of how that worked is where things get a little bit dicey, and the specifics are, what it means, of course, is that it's government by elected representatives of the people. But how does that exactly work? And on that, the states were real different. And they kind of changed from what they had been before the revolution. In a lot of ways, what these states are doing is just sort of keeping what they'd always done. They'd always had an assembly. They just now call it the legislature. Many of the features of the former colonial governments were just retained. But they started making some changes. And as a generalization, and this is complicated, you have to look at each state and sort of, well, here, this state, this state, this state. But as a generalization, we can say that overall, they're going to expand the idea of who were the people. They still had generally a property requirement, but as a kind of a common theme, many of the states changed the rules on what you had to do in order to qualify as property. It had been more, the standard, the simple thing that I told you before was that it was 50 acres of land, but they'd all had sort of kind of other qualifications. They had other provisions. They had ways to kind of get around that for people who didn't have that much. They had provisions to allow people who lived in cities and wouldn't have had 50 acres, let those people vote. They generally made it easier to vote. That's a generalization. It doesn't apply to every state, and the way they did it, it's complicated. You have to look at one state at a time and try to figure it all out. But we can leave it as a generalization that voting got a little bit easier so that they generally defined the people in a slightly more inclusive way. They brought in more people. But, and I think you can guess where this is going to go, it was still basically white males. The idea of doing anything else just isn't going to get caught on. Yeah, we're going to get more white males. We're going to let more people owning small farms. We're going to let more urban workers. We're going to let people, even though they don't exactly own a farm, but they pay taxes. That was one of the things that they did. They say, you know, if you don't own property but you pay taxes, then you can vote, you know. And, but they hardly ever, they just did not get outside of the bounds of white males. There were certainly efforts by women to be included. Women were definitely aware of the fact that they were not included in the concept of people. So there are organizations of women, there are individual women who raised the question. I mentioned last time John Adams, who's a very prominent person, and we've already talked about him, and we'll be hearing about him again. He's a key figure of this time, and he and his wife Abigail exchanged letters a lot. He was gone often on business. He spent some time by himself in France as our representative there during the war. And there were other times when he and she were separated, but they kept a lot of correspondence going on between them. Most of those letters have survived, so they're in the archives and we can look at them. And they're very close, and they were very fond of each other, and John Adams was totally loyal to Abigail, even though he spent a lot of time around other women, although he hung out with Ben Franklin and when they were in Paris, and Ben Franklin had all kinds of girlfriends. John Adams never did. So they were really close to each other, and they exchanged a lot of intimate thoughts, which are preserved. I mean, we know that, the very personal things that they said to each other. And Abigail Adams, she said, we women should be able to participate too. We're here, we're part of it. And so, women were kind of conscious of these things. And in fact, in one state, in New Jersey, there was a time, starting in the Revolution, when property owners, all property owners, were eligible to vote. Now, usually that by property owner you meant men, because under English law, which is what we followed, I mean, we use just the English common law, we use English common law on all sorts of things, women couldn't own property. I mean, just sort of by definition. It was very hard for a woman to own property. If she were married, by law, the property was her husband's, which meant, and if a woman was widowed and remarried, then by definition her husband acquired all of her property. And if she had kids and became a widow, then the kids would share the property, and then it would be the sons who got the inheritance. So very hard, there's not very many circumstances where a woman could end up as a property owner. So that's why it's easy to say, as we've been doing, that property owners meant white males. And in most cases it did, almost all cases it did. But there were some wrinkles in the law where a woman could end up owning property. She had to be unmarried, she couldn't have kids, but there were women who did that sort of thing. There were women in that position, and they're very rare, but they were there. And in New Jersey they could vote. And so they did. There were only, we don't know how many, I don't think, maybe somebody's done some research on this, haven't seen the results of the research, but there were women who voted. And then I think it was in 1801, I mean, there were so few probably that nobody really noticed it, and then they figured it out in 1801, they said, oh, and then they made sure they got the word male into the law and changed it so that we took away that one little tiny gain that a few women had made. So, all right, yes, the laws are getting easier to vote, but it's still white males. And of course, obviously, that meant we did not include any consideration of African Americans who could be free. There were a number of African Americans who were free. Under one way or another, people could get their freedom, especially in northern states where the great demand for slave labor did not exist. So there are free blacks in the South, more in the North, but they could not vote. And they were still discriminated against. During the Revolution, all African Americans became more aware of what was going on in the country. They knew, they found out about such things as the Declaration of Independence and the phrase that we talked about in the last class, all men are created equal. African Americans knew about that. African Americans knew that Americans, the people in the country, were fighting for their independence. They were fighting for their freedom. And African Americans were conscious of that and were asking themselves, and were asking publicly, what about us? Doesn't that include us? And so there were moves by African Americans to petition for freedom. There was an increase in runaway slaves, from what we can understand from like ads for runaways, ads that the owners would take to say, hey, my slave ran away, he looks like so-and-so. One of the things we find out when we look at those is that we realize that one of the things that a lot of owners did was to, in some way, what you might call mutilate their slaves. They would cut off an ear, or they would poke a hole in their some part of their body, or do something, cut off a finger, so that they would identify them. And so then when we see these ads, looking for my runaway slave, does not have a right ear. And that's the way that they could identify slaves. And so we find an increase during the Revolution and after of ads indicating that more and more slaves were running away. And there were organizations of African Americans that struggled to have recognition of their rights. And we know that they got almost nowhere. Almost nothing came of that. As I told you, even though there were whites who were sympathetic to this, there were whites who were disturbed by the concept of slavery, but they could never deal with it. They couldn't come up with an answer. And so it just, as I told you last time, it's like there's a brick wall. People are maybe driving along and saying, oh, slavery is wrong. And many of them were Christians. They said slavery is contrary to the Bible. Jesus said, or Paul said, that in the Bible, that the new religion that Jesus was sort of starting, that was going to be starting around him, believed that there were no such things as slave or free, so that they're aware of that. They know about other biblical references to freeing slaves. So between the Declaration of Independence and the Bible, there are a lot of people who read those and took it up and believed in it. But when they came, as I was telling you last time, when they came to the question of, well, what's going to happen to the slaves if we free them, then they just crashed into the wall and nowhere, and nothing comes of it. Nothing happens. End of story. So, although slaves are more aware of their status and more aware of the contradiction, the inherent contradiction between what America was saying about freedom and rights and all men being created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and all of that stuff, nothing goes. Nothing happened. Just as it didn't happen really for women. And if we want to look also at this whole broad issue of minorities in America, women and ethnic minorities, certainly there's no change in American attitudes towards Native Americans. During the Revolution, we solicited Native Americans as allies. And I think I mentioned that both during the 7 Years' War, a lot of the fighting was the Indians allied with the French versus Indians allied with the British. Same thing happened in the Revolution. The British had their Indian allies that would fight for them. We went out and recruited Indians to fight for us and fight against the British Indians. So there was a good deal of fighting in the West. There were some serious battles between pro-American Indians and pro-British Indians. So we went out and solicited the Indians and asked them to join us and so forth, and we'd offer them various inducements to come in and become our allies, but we still were after their property. I mean, we still expected them, as we always had, and this was the standard American attitude toward Native Americans: move out. We just want your land. We don't want to harm you if we don't have to. We prefer to do this peacefully. We prefer to negotiate with you and persuade you to go somewhere else. And we'll even justify it by saying we're doing it to preserve your culture, that you want to be able to go out and have your own culture the way you always had, but you can't do it here where we are. So if you want to have your tribal communities and your whole religious and ethnic culture the way you've always had, yeah, we're all in favor of that, but you got to do it somewhere else. You've got to do it further out to the west, because where you are is land that we now want. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy here of Americans going out and soliciting Indians as allies and then turning around and taking their property. So some of these things didn't change. Yeah, white males may have made a little progress, and white males who might not have been able to vote under the rules previously, now they could. The rules got changed. They got kind of liberalized. We can say they got a little bit easier to qualify as a voter. And we certainly are committed to the idea of having voters. I mean, we want people to be able to vote. We want people to be able to participate. We want people to become landowners. We want them to be able to participate in a Republican form of government. That's very important to us. That's why, as I told you, Jefferson convinced people in Virginia to give up that land in the West, because he wants to have Virginia be a republic. People are really committed to that. And certainly any idea of having any kind of a hereditary governmental structure is dead in the water. It goes nowhere. That one is definitely out. That one we all agree on. That's a given. But so we're going to make it a little bit easier for people to vote. We're going to kind of expand the definition of who qualifies in some kind of modest ways. Just change the rules a little bit here and there, tinker with the details, and it's just details, but it basically lets more people vote, but only white males. The state governments were, as I said, very much like colonial governments that had preceded them. In many states, Connecticut and Rhode Island, they just took their charter and said, okay, well, it's the Constitution. So they didn't change anything. States kind of tinker with things a little bit. Basically kept the idea of what they'd always had, a two-house legislature with a governor. That's what they'd always had as colonies. That's basically what they had as republics, as independent states. The difference, of course, was that the upper house of the legislature had been typically appointed by the governor. Now it's going to be elected by the people, usually not, and here's where they're all different, but usually maybe not directly by the people, but maybe the one house of the legislature, which had been previously the assembly, would now elect the other house or something. In some places, the governor was also elected by the legislature. Governors have been appointed by the king, and so that's out. But how they did this a little bit differently. Some they had the governors be elected directly by the people, and others they had the governors elected by the legislature. And they kind of piddled around and came up with different solutions to that. But but they still basically kept the idea of a two-house legislature. Some states got rid of two houses and just had one, so that makes them a little bit different. That's why it's hard to generalize, because a couple states experimented with single-house legislatures. But what they also kind of kept was the idea that the governor is going to be under the control of the legislature. As the governors in the colonial days, the royal governors had definitely been under the control of the assembly. And the key was, in colonial days, only the assembly could tax. That's still true. Under the new state constitutions, the whole power of the purse was in the hands of the legislature, as it had always been. Governors generally could not veto acts of the legislature. Every state's a little bit different on this. In some states, the governor technically could veto an act of the legislature, but not effectively. All the governor could do was to say, well, think about this and see if you want to pass it again. And he could send it back to the legislature and ask them to reconsider. And if he could convince people to change their vote, then maybe he could get it defeated. But he couldn't just veto it. He couldn't just block it and say, no, this is out, and that's that. If he could do that, his veto could just be overridden by a simple majority. So if he couldn't change anybody's minds, if the legislature votes the same way it does, it just takes the same vote and it just passes over his rule. So governors were generally weak. And this is something that Americans are familiar with. This is what they'd always had. They'd always had weak governors, and that's what they kept. So their concept of a republic is very much tied to the idea of having a legislative body elected by the people the way it had always been, and that's what they want. The fact that there had been a royal governor that somehow could overrule them, we've gotten rid of that. The governors had not ever really been able to exercise that power very much, but they had it. Now they don't even have it. So we're moving away from any idea of a strong legislature. Now, some of you may know about a judicial branch. Well, every state had a court system, but they don't consider the court system as part of the government. And that had been true of England. I mean, in England they had courts. They'd always had courts. I mean, courts are very important. And courts have to decide all of these legal issues. Usually they revolve in one way or another over property ownership. That's the big issue, of course, is who owns the property, who inherits, what can they do with the property when they inherit it, and all these other things. There's a lot of complexities of the law. And we still had that. We still use the same rules for our courts. The basic common law was still applied, and we still had courts. But the courts are not part of the Constitution. The courts are just the courts. They are there to apply the law in specific cases. I mean, that's what a judge does. A judge is there as a person who's knowledgeable about the law, knows what the law is, and says, well, here is what the law says, here's how it applies in this case. Judges can only act if there is a case, if there's a dispute, if somebody comes in and says, well, the law is on my side, and then somebody else says, no, the law is on my side, and then the judge says, no, here is what the law is, here's who is right in this case, and they just interpret the law, they just apply it to specific cases. So that's what judges do, and they were not part of any state constitution. They certainly are there, but they're just there. Another feature that I want to say is that every state had, in one way or another, a Bill of Rights. I mean, Americans are very conscious of this concept of natural rights. That's why we had a revolution. England, we felt, was taking away our rights. Parliament was moving in ways to deprive us of the rights that we had always had as British subjects. The right to a trial by jury with the Admiralty courts, they were taking that away. The right to elect our own representatives and have our representatives govern us, have only our representatives be able to tax us. I mean, that's what we'd always had. And England was trying to change that. So that's why we became independent. But the starting point here is rights. The starting point here is John Locke's concept that governments exist to protect our rights. So we're real conscious of the need to have rights. And we'd had big disputes with England over exactly what those rights were. So the states, in one way or another, all adopted a Bill of Rights. They want to spell it out and say, here is what it is. This is what we're all about. We've got a state government. The government is there to protect the rights. Here's what the rights are. And they spell them out. It's just impossible to go further than that, to try to figure out what those rights are. Well, I'll start on it a little bit, but because every state was different. I mean, they were really different on how they thought of rights. The exact format of their Bill of Rights is different. In some cases, it's part of the Constitution. In some states, it's a separate document. In some states, it's just simply an act of the legislature. The specifics of it, the form of it, the structure of it are very different, so it's just really impossible. But I do want to make just one analysis of this concept of rights that was very common and was universally accepted. What Americans considered as sort of the beginning of rights was freedom of religion. They all were committed in some way or another to the idea of the right of everybody to worship as he or she believed. They all accepted, and they all had some provision. I mean, their Bills of Rights are very different, but they all included something to the effect of freedom of religion. So that's a key freedom for Americans, the right to choose your own religion. And in some ways, this was because of our rejection of the Church of England. As part of our whole move for independence, we all felt that the Church of England was an example of England's interfering with our rights, and so we wanted to have freedom of religion, to reject the idea that there would be an established Church of England. Now, this is a little bit weird because, as I told you, yeah, in most of the colonies, the Church of England had been the established church. That was the law. Everybody had to be part of the Church of England. But I told you that really didn't operate very much. It wasn't really that restrictive. The Church of England hardly ever really enforced its position. They hardly ever really tried to prevent anybody from doing whatever they wanted. There were all kinds of off-the-roof kinds of religious groups in America, evangelical groups. There was an event that I didn't mention, or a movement called back in the 1740s, called the Great Awakening, when there had been this big religious revival, and all kinds of people took up religion and became, there's kind of what we would today call storefront churches or something like that. So there are all kinds of kind of off-the-wall religious groups that were not part of any major denomination, and they'd all existed. They'd all had their own little communities. They all had, many of them revolved around a kind of a very dynamic speaker, one person who's sort of self-ordained as a pastor and attracts a group of loyal followers who follow his beliefs and so forth, and they operate as a a little community church, and there had been a lot of those. And the Church of England, they're all illegal under the rules, but the Church of England never really tried to crack down on any of those. But they just had this grievance. They just had this feeling that, oh, the Church of England is this oppressive body that's preventing us from worshiping as we wish. Which hardly ever did, but people thought it did. So, and they were real conscious of it, and so they made a big deal of adopting freedom of religion. You know, Thomas Jefferson, who is, you know, he's one of the smart guys, he wrote for Virginia, and one of the things that he got Virginia to adopt was a rule establishing a freedom of religion and disestablishing the Church of England in Virginia. And he was very proud of that. He thought that in terms of his whole lifetime achievements, you know, back as an elderly man, as a senior citizen, he looks back and he says of the things that he's proudest of, the things that he felt were most important of his accomplishments in life. One of them was to disestablish the Church of England. Well, come on, Tom. The Church of England was not that big a deal. It was not that much of a problem. Nobody really got bothered by it and so forth. But he was like a lot of Americans. He was just obsessed with this idea, we got to have freedom of religion. It's got to be in the books. It's got to be in the Constitution. It's got to be in the Bill of Rights, whatever. So there's this big emphasis on Bill of Rights. Yeah, okay. But, and people made a big deal of it, even though, in my judgment, it wasn't. That they had never really been oppressed. The only place where I think where freedom of religion had been a little bit dicey was in New England, and where the Puritans were still the dominant force. It wasn't the Church of England, it was the Puritans, and they could be oppressive. They could sort of demand that everybody be a part of it. And state law still regarded the Puritan church as the established church. There was an established church in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and I forget the dates, but I think Massachusetts kept it on the books until 1825, you know, well, in half a century after the Revolution. And Connecticut, I think, until like 1833 or something. I mean, they still had an established religion where it really amounted to something. So to the extent that there were established religions, of all things, it's not the Church of England, it's the Puritans who left England because they objected to the Church of England. They were fighting against the Church of England. So it's kind of weird, but that's the way it was. And if you can make sense out of it, well, you're doing better than I can. I don't understand why people were so obsessed by it. I know that they were, and I know it was a big deal. So, we've got these state governments, and they all have their constitutions, and they're committed to the idea of a republic. They're committed to the idea of a government that exists to protect the rights of the people, and they're slowly but surely making at least some modest steps to define the people a little bit more broadly, but not taking the important steps. The important steps would have been to say, we're going to include women, we're going to include people of color. Well, no, not that. But within the idea of white males, it's a little less restrictive. So that's you know, a small step, but you take one step at a time. As I said, these states controlled all of their trade. They controlled their state economies. And so I want to look at that now and say, well, how did that go? How did things work with the states each having their own state government and their own economic policy? And look at the years after the war, after when the Revolutionary War was over. Well, how did it go? And the answer is not well. The answer is, in fact, very poorly. America in the 1780s, in the years after the war was over, and we were independent, and we'd gotten our independence, even though we didn't exactly win the war, but the fact that we didn't lose, and then we got a real good treaty, our negotiators, in Paris in 1783 got a real good treaty for us. So, you know, we didn't exactly win the war, but we won the peace, we won the treaty. So, you know, that's all fine. And the country was in bad shape economically. The sort of the key to this, the starting point of this, was that we had always depended economically on our exports of agricultural products. We're a nation of farmers. We produce all kinds of goods for export, for sale. We're engaged in commercial agriculture. People would have, you know, typically on a farm they'd have maybe a little field where they'd grow some vegetables and some other things for home consumption, or they just buy it from the neighbors or whatever. But basically what you're doing is you're raising grain, you're raising tobacco in certain areas, you're raising sugar in certain areas. You're raising a product for sale, for export, and that means we depend on trade. We depend on exports of our agricultural products, and we sell them to a lot of the parts of the world. We sell it to the countries around the Mediterranean. We sell a lot of it to the West Indies. That's a big, big market for us, and our trade with the West Indies is very important to us. That's why we don't want to follow the English laws, because England tried to restrict our trade with the West Indies. And no, that's our major trading partner, so we're going to go ahead and trade anyway. We're just going to smuggle and break the laws, because that's an important part of our trade. But, you know, bottom line was our biggest customer was England. I mean, you know, that's not a trick. I mean, most of our trade was with England itself. I mean, we were English colonies, and we did our trade with England, and we're part of the British Empire. I mean, we're loyal British subjects. We trade within the British Empire. I mean, that's the way it works. Yeah, we smuggle with Cuba, but that doesn't count. We'll overlook that. We'll pretend that doesn't exist. Well, of course, during the war, our trade with England went down to zero, or except maybe, I don't know, there might have been some smuggling where Americans and England would allow the trade, even though it was, you know, it was between enemies. I mean, England was our enemy, so we weren't trading with England. We did increase our trade with the Mediterranean. That was a plus. That kind of compensated a little bit for our loss of trade with England. One of the big achievements of the Congress during the war that I didn't mention was that in order to trade with the Mediterranean, you had to deal with the Muslims in North Africa. And the Muslims of North Africa kind of regarded the Mediterranean as theirs, and forever they would allow Europeans to trade there only with their approval, and European nations had made agreements with various Muslim entities in North Africa, in Tunis and in Libya and those countries around in there, Algiers. We'd cut Europeans, and then us as part of the European British Empire, we cut a deal with the North Africans to be able to trade there. And so when we declared our independence, we got some negotiations specifically with Morocco, one of the major sort of powers of Muslim countries in North Africa. And we cut a deal with Morocco to allow us to trade in the Mediterranean, and other Arab North Africans accepted that. And so that was a plus. That, you know, the negotiations with Morocco were very favorable, and that was really important to us, because then we were able to trade with the Mediterranean as we'd been doing forever as part of the British Empire. Now, as an independent country, Morocco extended us the same rights that we had had as a colony. And that was a plus. So we got to pick that up a little bit. Our trade with the West Indies probably increased. We'd always traded there a lot, but it had always been illegal. Now we don't have to worry about breaking the law, so we probably increased our trade with the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and whoever down in the Caribbean. So that sort of offset our loss of trade to England. But the main thing that offset our trade with England was that there was a war going on. There were lots of armies out there. On the American side, there's the militias and the Continental Army. And then, of course, there's the British Army that needs supplies. And the British Army are going to buy their supplies from American farmers. They're going to buy from American producers. They're not going to bring grain over across the ocean from England and try to make it into bread here when they're dealing with this great agricultural center where you got a nation of small farmers, and so England kind of mainly took up the slack with the purchase of American farm goods. So in fact, during the war, the demand for American goods, even though we're not able to sell to England anymore, but the demand for our agricultural products increased significantly. And the result was, when there's a big increase in demand, if you understand anything about basic economics, supply and demand, prices went up. The prices of farm goods went up drastically. Farmers were making a lot more money by selling products between the American armies, the British armies, the exports that we had to the Caribbean, the exports we had to the Mediterranean, whatever. In fact, American farmers found that farm prices, agricultural prices, were increasing dramatically, and so the price of land was going up. Any farmer who was in a personal situation where he could expand his acreage, expand his land, that would depend on his personal situation. Is he in the army? If not, why not? If he is his wife running the farm? Every person is sort of in a different situation. But among all of the Americans, there were a number who were in a situation where they were able to expand their output. They could acquire additional land, or they could become farmers for the first time. They could become landowners because the prices of land is just going up. And man, if you can get some land, you can make a ton of money because the price of the stuff you grow on that land is going to go up. So there's a great demand for land, great increase in price. Where do you get the money? Well, what you do is you borrow money from wealthy Americans. So wealthy Americans are lending money to Congress, but they're also lending money to the farmers to enable them to buy additional land. With the prices of land going up, and people who own land and maybe were in a position where they didn't want to stay farming anymore, or they couldn't, they were dead, whatever, they're selling the land and they're making a good price and they're getting out with a lot of money in their pocket. So there's this big, huge, what we would today call inflation of prices, and things are going on in America, and people are borrowing money and so forth. And so, from the agricultural standpoint, the war was a boom time. It's a time of tremendous prosperity, expansion, growth. Prices are going up. Everybody's making a lot of money. And then the war ended. The British Army went home. The American armies all demobilized. It's a little hard to generalize because every place is a little bit different, but the militias stood down. People went back to their farms. Maybe one of the things that had happened not only was the demand for agricultural products increasing, but the supply was decreasing because a lot of farms were not in production, or at least they were limited, where maybe the wife and kids were trying to carry on a little bit of the farming, but couldn't do as much as when the husband had been there. But now, because he's off in the army or in the militia or whatever, now he's back. So farm production gets back a little bit closer to normal, but the demand is just not there. So the prices, which had soared during the Revolution, collapse. I mean, there's just a big, huge downturn. Land values collapse. The market just is down, just drastically. And this causes a lot of hardship for farmers. Many of them were in debt. Many of them, depending on what their personal situation had been during the war, if they had been in a position, which many of them were, to acquire more land, they've done so, but they've borrowed money, they've got a mortgage, and they're in arrears on their mortgage. They can't pay the debt. They've done it on the idea that, well, the price of grain is so much, it's so high, and we're making all this money, and so we're going to produce all this grain, and we're going to get rich and happy, and everything is going to be wonderful, and so forth. And now, all of a sudden, the price of grain has just collapsed, and so they find themselves with this big, huge debt, and no income to pay it. Legally, the wealthy people who had loaned the money, they can foreclose on that mortgage. I mean, there's a mortgage. That's a legal document. It's a legal contract. And the farmer's in violation. He's not paying his mortgage payments as he's obligated to do by the terms of this legal document. And the only thing that's happening is that a lot of the rich people are just not foreclosing, not because they can't, because they just choose not to, because they realize, what good would it do to foreclose on the mortgage? Yeah, I'd end up with some land, but what would I do with it? I'm not a farmer. I'm a wealthy merchant or whatever. What am I going to do with this land? It's not going to help me. I'm not going to be able to sell it because there's so much land being foreclosed. If everybody forecloses, there's just going to be this flood of property onto the market, and nobody's going to be able to make anything, and it's going to be a disaster. So let me just, I'm not getting the income from the mortgage that I counted on. I'd been counting on the farmer paying me monthly payments and he's not. But I don't have anything I can do about it. I mean, I can't make him produce when his prices are so low. So he doesn't have the money, and so what good would it do? So I'm just going to kind of sit and hope that something happens, hope that this changes, and wait it out, and meanwhile just let him go. And so a lot of farmers are out there, and they're able to hold on to their land, even though they're in arrears on their mortgage, but they're there with just the good wishes of their lender, the person who would loan them the money. And they're just hanging on by his unwillingness to take the tough stance and foreclose on a mortgage. So there's a lot of farmers are hurting, and then their creditors are hurting. So there's a lot of economic difficulty. In addition, states had also borrowed money during the war. Now, we talked about how Congress borrowed a lot of money to pay for the Continental Army. In addition, many state legislatures had borrowed money to pay for their militias, because they all had, or many of them had expanded militia operations, and they had expanded expense. Now, this is a little bit complicated because the states are different, and each state has its own situation. Some states had borrowed a lot of money. Some states had borrowed very little money. So when the war ended, the time that we're starting to look at here, and the war is over, some states are facing huge debts, and some states have very modest or even almost no debts. And what determines that is basically how much they'd had to borrow. Well, that's obvious. And some states had borrowed a lot of money and others had not. But it kind of depended on how much their militia had been involved in fighting. In some states, the militias had been very active. The militias had been fighting for many years. They were involved in all kinds of combat A lot of the members of the militia had actually gone out to fight and had to be supported by the legislature. In other states, the militias had been very limited. There was very little combat. There was very little need for an active militia in some of the states. Now we can kind of generalize about this. We can kind of generalize and we can say, and this doesn't work 100%, but it's as close we can get as to make a generalization out of 13 states and to try to simplify it into two groups. The northern states had been the states where in fact most of the fighting had taken place. So those states had had very active militias, and they were then the states that had the heaviest debts. Fighting in the South had been much more limited. It was not until near the end of the war that the British Army decided to kind of focus their activities a little bit more on the South. But for much of the war, there was little or no fighting in the South. Between the British Army, there was a lot of fighting between the Loyalists and the radical Americans, the Patriots, as we could call them. But the British Army had not been down there, and so the militias had not been very active, and so the states had not had to borrow money. So it's very uneven. Some states have a big debt, and some states have a little debt. And what the states have been doing about those debts is also very, very different. Now, I'm looking at the old clock on the wall, and I see that my time is about up. And this is going to be a big topic, so I'm going to leave it until the next class. We're going to start talking about what different states did about their state debts, how they dealt with these debts differently. But I want to give you now a question here for to write on an answer. This kind of is taken from the previous lecture as well, but here's your question. What were the two most important things that the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, could not do? What were the two big failures of the state legislatures, of state governments under the Articles of Confederation? And we'll see you in the next class.